I thought that I would like to begin, as William Buckley used to say, on the old firing line. I should like to begin by saying that I detected in the very last staves of what you read from Melville an implied, should we say, challenge or admonition, where you announced what the decent conditions were for laying down your spear. In other words, at what point it would be right to say we would stop struggling or cease to complain or cease battling. Am I wrong in thinking that there was a...
Well, I mean, I think what was implied was that there really aren't any conditions for laying down one spear. One goes on till it's no longer possible. But, I mean, I'm an aficionado, to use that word again, of lost causes. And I think no cause is lost until one loses consciousness. And I really believe that it's all in the mind.
Can you speak up a little, Edward? I have a feeling you're not quite getting...
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, if not all, is in the mind. And that the conditions for struggle are always ripe and always there, so long as one can think. And thinking itself is an act of resistance, properly speaking. So that's what I take out of that final passage of Moby Dick. And in a way, it seems to me to be symbolic of these sort of intellectuals' vocation, not to rest when you reach the promised land, because there isn't a promised land, really. There's just another phase in the struggle.
I remember talking to you once, this must have been 10 or more years ago, when you said that though your family had lost its home and its house in Jerusalem and much of its property and so on, you didn't think of yourself as one of the victims or refugees. You didn't consider yourself to be one of the losers in this.
No, I don't. I don't really have a victim's mentality on any front. I mean, obviously, I had a very, very privileged life, and I went to good schools and have lived really free of that particular kind of threat that most Palestinians live under. Because I've been sheltered to some extent by my American citizenship. But on the other hand, I do feel inescapably the plight of others. I mean, my whole family, my extended family, was made refugees in 1948, so that there isn't anybody related to me who still lives in Palestine. They were all evicted in 1948. And in various ways, I think all of us of the generation of 48 have been marked, even those of us who were fortunate enough not actually to be refugees. But for instance, none of us can return except as visitors. And for the older members of my family, the itinerant life, the ruthlessness, the sadness, the irrecoverability of what was lost has marked us into the second and third generation.
Something in this question would depend on my tone of voice, so I hope you won't misunderstand if I say, do you think that there's an element of noblesse oblige, in other words, in what you do, in the feeling that you're luckier than the others and therefore it's more your job to say something?
No, I don't think of it that way. I think of it as everyone's job as a Palestinian to testify, at the very least, to what happened. I mean, that's been our problem, and it's not for nothing that I'm interested in all those states which are so fugitive and which are unrecorded, whether they're blissful ones, those having to do with art, but also political ones like Exile. That it seems to me, that just by being, in a way, you are expressing it or articulating it in some way. And my way happens to be this way, but I don't think most of us have a choice. And I've noticed it, in the most mundane of situations. I mean, Palestinians who try to hide their background or their ancestry or origin, for example, going through an immigration line, are always found out. I mean, you carry your past with you. I think that's true of most people, but particularly those who are marked. And if you're marked, there's very little you can do about it, except, well, you can hide it or deny it in some way, or you can accepted and
like
battle
John
on.
Sununu saying he's Lebanese American.
Yes, I mean, that's a perfect, I'm glad you brought it up, actually. He's
Self-hating-
only now
self-hating
Palestinian. I don't know if everybody got the illusion. John Sununu, who was, as you know, a White House regular at one point, used to say about himself...
And maybe again we hear.
Maybe again. That he was...
Since there appears to be a certain amount of recycling going on in my old hometown.
Anyway, it's not Sununu, it's Sununu, is the Palestinian pronunciation. I grew up with the name in my ears because one of the Sununus was a classmate of my father's in St. George's. And I was always mystified by this, I'm a Lebanese or something. But they're Palestinians. He's now finally admitted it. I don't know, maybe there's a little more glamour to it now than there was then. But he couldn't get away from it. They found him out in the end.
But Korn Mem and I speak as someone who, with embarrassment in a way, because I speak as someone who, on production of a piece of paper or two, could go and live in Jerusalem any time I liked.
Yes,
I wanted to claim the law of return, and don't particularly want to move into a home into which you've been evicted. But speak to the point that it isn't escapable, I suppose, which is that the way that the world at large became aware of it was because of the willingness of Palestinians to use what is sometimes called terrorist force. In other words, to commit suicide by setting off a car bomb or attack civil aviation or some other kind of thing. Now, I want to know exactly what you think about all of that.
Well, it caught the media's attention, certainly. But, I mean, what was also taking place was the emergence of a mass movement well before these adventurous events that you mentioned took place in the early 70s. I mean, there was the family...
Well, I'm not referring just to the past, actually.
Oh, what are you referring to?
Well, to people's willingness to do that kind of thing now.
The word terrorism doesn't come so easily to my mouth as it does to others. That is to say, it seems to me that bombing of civilians with helicopter gunships and tanks and missiles is a far worse kind of... is a far worse kind of terrorism than the acts of desperate, miserably destitute people with no horizon of hope, which is what Palestinians in the occupied territories have been reduced to by deliberate policy of collective punishment. I mean, how many states that we know of in the early 21st century are using medieval siege tactics? I don't mean metaphorical sieges. I mean actually digging ditches around towns and villages so that people can't go in and out, so that they can't be treated by doctors, they can't be supplied with medicine or food, children can't go to schools. This is taking place right now. So in the face of this, that kind of measure whereby innocent people are killed are part of a very ugly mix in which the weak are the ones who pay the highest price, always. I don't condone it at all. I've always condemned it because it does seem to bring down more rage and suffering on all Palestinians as a result.
Your criticism of it would not just be tactical, though, presumably.
No, it's not just a matter of tactical. I don't believe in it because I believe that in our circumstances, what we need is a movement of mass protest to impede the Israeli project for the West Bank and Gaza, which is to build more settlements and take land away. That has to be dealt with collectively. It can't be dealt with individual actions. So it's a moral objection, it's a tactical and strategic objection, and above all, it seems to me not to advance the cause, which is to liberate occupied territory.
Now, the question for someone striking up in that chord would be, well, is there to be an answering chord on the Israeli side? And to stay with the musical, my Brother Poultry musical analogy, I wondered if you would tell us about your friendship with Daniel Barenboim.
Oh, yes. Daniel Barenboim and I met completely by chance in the lobby of a London hotel about 10 years ago. We were both staying there, and I was doing the Reith lectures at the BBC, and he was... I had actually just bought a ticket for a concert he was about to give the next night or that weekend, and I recognized him, and he claims to recognize me, but I doubt it. Anyway, and so we spent most of the week...
I thought mutual recognition was your mantra.
No, Palestinians are always ready to recognize the other. And so we spent the weekend actually, he practicing, I polishing my lectures, but in between meeting and talking. And it blossomed into a great friendship, I think. And he was the first, I think, and as far as I know, the last Israeli to play a concert on the West Bank, which I arranged for him to do at Birzeit in the winter of 1999.
Birzeit being the university?
Yeah, Birzeit University, the leading university on the West Bank, which is, has been closed for the last 3 or 4 months by the Israelis, by the siege that I referred to. And he donated his services, and there was a great deal of trepidation because he was Israeli, and there was a lot of tension. But he very bravely came. We drove there together. A piano was shipped from Jerusalem for him to play, and he played to an audience composed entirely of Palestinians. And he gave a speech at the end. I gave a speech in Arabic at the beginning. He gave one at the end after he played. He then played an encore. And by the way, he played a full program. It wasn't a token kind of, musical lollipops, but it was a real, quite challenging program. And at the end of the program, before he gave the speech, he played an encore with a very gifted young Palestinian pianist, whom I should also say he has taken on as a kind of protege. He's with him in Berlin, even as we speak. And then he gave a speech to the audience in which he said, the necessity to make a gesture. He's not a politician, but he did feel that the mutual ignorance and hostility between two peoples who are destined to live together simply won't do. Subsequent to that, may I just go on a bit?
Please.
We did something quite unusual, which I'm very, very happy to be able to tell people here about. It was the summer of 1999. And I'll spare all the details, but 1999 was the year in which Weimar in East Germany, now part, of course, of the United Germany, was the cultural capital of Europe. And Weimar being, of course, the great culture city of Germany. I mean, it's the seat of where...
It's a slightly freighted name.
Well, I'm coming to that. Goethe lived there for 50 years. Liszt lived there. Bach worked there. And on and on. Schiller was there. But it's also the city where, 5 kilometers outside the city, where Buchenwald was to be found. So in that site, in a music school or gymnasium, we had a musical workshop, which Daniel conducted an orchestra. Yo-Yo Ma was there to give master classes, as was Daniel in piano. And I was called in German the Diskussionsleiter, the discussion leader at night, and we discussed politics and music. And who were the participants? Well, they were a carefully selected group of 78 musicians from Israel and most of the neighboring Arab countries, including Lebanon and Syria. There were 12 Syrian musicians. There were about 10 Palestinians. There were at least 15 Egyptians. There was an Iraqi. There was a Tunisian. And a group of Israelis. And they all played together in this orchestra, which Daniel rehearsed daily for about 3 weeks. In the most painstaking way. It was an extraordinary education for everyone to watch him take the Beethoven 7th Symphony apart, measure by measure. And then they would do that during the day. There would be a lunch break. They would resume in the afternoon. There would be master classes, chamber music. And then at night there would be the discussion. And then after the discussion, there was a kind of musical encore. And Daniel and Yo-Yo Ma, we're talking about 11:30 at night, a day that began at 9 in the morning without any breaks. They would play chamber music together, and there were others as well. I once played with Yo-Yo Ma. We played the Arpeggione Sonata of Schubert. It was a massacre of the piece. But it was quite extraordinary because the kid, first of all, there was nothing political about it. No politics were ever discussed, but they started out with healthy suspicion of each other. And by the end, I was personally witness to the blossoming, not to say tragic, love affair of an Israeli cellist and a Syrian violinist who were embracing madly the last 2-3 days and separated tearfully at the end of the thing. And it's now continued. It's become institutionalized. So there was a Weimar last summer, and this year the auditions have already been held for young musicians, and it will be taking place in Chicago. So that in addition to all of the music making, they will have exposure to the Chicago Symphony, a great orchestra, which most of them have never had before. And what's astonishing is the fact that all the normal barriers, including musical barriers, were broken down in a common goal, based on the principle that we all felt, Daniel and I and Yo-Yo too, that people should know how to live together before they talk about things like peace and negotiate. There are two things further I want to just mention. One is that near the end of the session, we took a visit to Buchenwald. And it was difficult for everyone, because Daniel, after we came back, was challenged in the evening discussion by one of the Jewish kids from Israel, who said to him, how can you live in Germany? And he does indeed live in Germany and conducts the Berlin State Opera. So he explained, I must say at great length, and much too much length, it was actually very moving, that he couldn't stop talking. In some way to explain how, as an Israeli and a Jew who had grown up in Argentina but had never experienced anti-Semitism, managed still to live in Germany, and not only that, but conduct Wagner at Bayreuth, which was a seat, as everyone knows, of cultural Nazism. For the Arabs, it was very difficult, and Daniel acknowledged it, because there was no comparable catastrophe for them to visit. For the Jewish kids, it was hard. One of the boys who was sitting next to me in the bus, who was a very gifted pianist, Israeli pianist, not knowing quite what to say to him, I said, "Have you ever been here before?" He said, "Yes." And I was quite surprised, because I thought nobody had visited the place before. And I said, "How?" He said, "Well, about 10 years ago, I came here with my father." And I said, "What brought you here?" He said, "My father had been an inmate in the camp and survived Buchenwald." So that's one episode. Another one, if I might just conclude with this, is one of the surprises of the session was a 10-year-old boy called Karim. I won't reveal his last name for a moment, but he was a very diminutive 10-year-old with an owlish pair of spectacles, and extremely articulate and intelligent, but also a piano prodigy. I mean, he would have master classes with Barenboim, who was a piano prodigy himself at the age of 7, that were public events. 300-400 people would attend this tiny little boy whose feet couldn't reach the pedals, but having to stand and play like this, the piano, being tutored by Barenboim, and say, "Look at this guy play." It was really quite amazing. Well, who was that boy? His name was Karim Said. He was the grandson of my cousin, Albert, who was the closest person to me, the closest person who was a brother to me, actually, my cousin, who was singularly unmusical. In fact, when he sang...
Abnormally unpromising.
Exactly. That when Saids were known for this, at St. George's, during choir practice, a false note would be hit and the choir master would stop and say, "Is there a Said in the choir?" Now, Albert, now dead, unfortunately, would repeat the story all through my childhood. Well, here was his grandson, a Palestinian boy, the favored piano student of Barenboim, an Israeli musician. Strange ways.
I was thinking while you were talking that the question, why should a Jew live in Germany, is not originally a question asked by Jews. But that wouldn't be the only irony of this history. I was also thinking of Ilan Halavi. Ilan Halavi, for those of you who don't know, is one of the Jewish members of the PLO executive who came to Washington for the signing of the Oslo Agreement, and who I met, and who, unlike you, at least then favored the Oslo Accords. But he said there'd been a big discussion in the group when they were first offered the Gaza Strip as their initial tranche of homeland. A lot of them thought it was a trap. It's an old story, giving away Gaza, and how hard it is to do. And Ilan Halavi had said, "No, I think we should say to the Israelis, yes, we'll take Gaza, but now what will you give us in return?" I thought it was nice that the only decent Woody Allen joke made in the entire process was by a Jewish member of the PLO. And David Grossman reminds us, those of you who read David Grossman's work, that there are more Israeli Arabs who speak Hebrew than there are American Jews who speak Hebrew. In other words, the potential exists for mutuality and for a common language. And yet, Daniel Barenboim can play at Bizet, and many other extraordinary events can occur, but your books are banned by Yasser Arafat. Can you speak to that?
Well, they were banned, but in 1996, in Gaza and the West Bank, in the Arabic versions of my books, the English versions could be bought in Stimatsky's in Israel. But The thing is that they obviously survived the banning, partly because of Xeroxing and mimeographing and this sort of thing, and partly because of the email. And the great irony, which I don't think I ever told you this, about a year after they were banned, I got a letter from the mendacious soul who banned them, namely the Minister of Information, who, of course, said, I knew nothing about it. He said, when I saw him, he said, I was just made to do it, and when he finally fessed up. But that wasn't the greatest irony. The greatest irony was when he wrote me a year ago to New York and asked me if the authority could have the license to publish my books.
That's a Jewish joke in its way as well, I somehow feel. You've mentioned St. George's more than once now, and I'm not sure everyone knows, so I'll just elucidate by saying that Edward Said comes from a Palestinian family in Jerusalem that's associated with the Anglican, or some would say the Episcopalian communion around St. George's Cathedral in the Old City.
Where I was baptized.
Where you were baptized. And schooled. The situation for Palestinian Christians is how, would you say? One sometimes reads that there's an Islamic wave that doesn't like the feeling that thinks the Palestinian Christians aren't quite kosher, if you'll allow the expression.
I think that's been much exaggerated. I mean, you know, part of my family is Lebanese, and Lebanon is a place where there have been very strong sectarian, where there has been strong sectarian dissension between Christians and Muslims, and indeed between Christians of different sects. I mean, Greek Orthodox and Maronites, for example, don't like each other very much. But all through my childhood and early adolescence and maturity, religion was never an issue. I mean, everybody knows from my name, Edward, that I'm not Muslim. But I've never felt any invidious distinction between myself and the others, because our culture is the same. I mean, it's a Muslim Arab culture. And I do feel that none of us that I know, at any rate, has felt discriminated against simply because we're Christian. Now, where there is a distinction is that many Christians, we're a small minority in Palestine, have immigration open to them by virtue of these communities, such as the Anglican and others, that make it easier for people to leave. But I think a very strong principle of all Palestinians today is not to leave, but to stay. Sumud, it's called in Arabic, which is to stay on the land, because obviously it would suit the Israelis if more of us left. So there's that to say. And the other thing, I think, is that the question of religion only comes up, as it has with me frequently, when religious politics are concerned. And there, I think many of us, certainly I'm second to none, in opposing the mixture of religion and politics that is not just a feature of Islam, but as we know in this country, I mean, you know, Christian fundamentalism, to me, is just as dangerous and just as unsavory mix as Islamic fundamentalism and Jewish fundamentalism. I mean, they all partake of the same element, and they make dialogue and coexistence virtually impossible. So I've been very outspoken, as you know. I mean, we've shared platforms, for example, on the Rushdie matter, on the Satanic Verses. Well, it's not so easy to talk about it in the Arab and Islamic world, but I've done it quite openly. And I've maybe because of who I am and so on, but I remember once giving a lecture in Cairo in 1989, just a month after the banning of the Satanic Verses. And surprisingly, there were a lot of, I was speaking in Arabic, and I made a few introductory words, but then people were allowed to ask questions. And I was told by the introducer and friends, writers, who said, you know, Edward, please don't bring up the Islamic verses. It's a subject we've decided not to discuss. So when the questions started rolling in, they were all about these Satanic verses. So there was no evading the subject. So I bit the bullet, and I figured it would be better to go down, you know, spear in hand. So I made the most incendiary remarks about Islamic rejectionism and banning books that hadn't been read, because there was no Arabic translation, of course, of the Satanic Verses. And sure enough, in the back row, perhaps they're here tonight, I can't see, there was a row of bearded and veiled pious people from Islam. And they listened a bit as I did my number. And then they listened to the next thing. Well, I think I started to speak about Mahfouz or somebody else. And 10 minutes later, they all got up and walked out. Well, silent protest is better than others, I suppose. But that's been my experience. I think if you talk about it directly, whether you're a Christian or Muslim or Jewish, it's better than to go around, beat around the bush and so on.
You once used the phrase secular criticism in a literary context,
yeah.
and you didn't mean it to imply agnostic criticism or atheist criticism. But
no, secular.
Secularism means something to you, clearly, which
yes.
you should say more
well,
about.
It means the world of history, the world made by human beings. One of the great lessons of Vico, the Neapolitan philosopher of the middle of the 18th century, who was a great influence on me, and on thousands, millions of other people, including Marx, was to make a distinction between human history and secular history on the one hand, and religious history or sacred history on the other. And sacred history is the province of religion and of God and revelation. Secular history is the world in which no revelation is possible, because it's a world made by human labor, which, among its most important features, is comprehensible, right, and changeable and subject to human agency. And I think that's where I think one's effort should be. And I've tried to make my effort there and not in the world of religion, which is unarguable. They're final and first principles that you can't touch, and therefore are, to me, in a sense, worthless and off limits.
You, I don't really know how. I haven't decided in my mind. I knew I wanted to ask you, but I decided not to decide in advance how to phrase this, but you haven't been at all well now for some time, have you?
No, that too I think is better talked about than left unsaid. I have leukemia, and I've been ill for, I was diagnosed 10 years ago, and I've been in treatment for the last 8 years. I'm now in my 8th year of treatment. Well, I mean, it isn't easy. I've had every conceivable kind of treatment, from chemotherapy to radiation to once, I hope I offended somebody perhaps here, I once tried alternative medicine. I went to see a Chinese doctor, which seemed to have doomed me to no results whatever and brewing the most unsavory teas in the house that my family threatened to leave. So I gave up on that after a year's effort. I'm in the hands, this is one of the great ironies perhaps and pleasures of living in the United States. I'm in the hands of a phenomenally gifted doctor who is Indian. It took me several tries to find him. At the end I found him. His name's Kanti Rai. He practices in a Jewish hospital. The nurses who tend me are Irish and Catholic. His assistant is Native American, and I'm Palestinian. So it's a mix of a kind that doesn't need to be resolved. The only necessary result is that I keep going, and he's kept me going. At times it's difficult because the effects of therapy, for those of you who've gone through it, you know it, are sometimes more debilitating than the disease itself. But I think the central thing is to face up to it and, discuss it if it needs to be discussed, and find yourself a good doctor.
Are you aware of any way in which it's concentrated your mind, to use the old cliche?
Very much so. I mean, I work at a frantic pace. I find the need for sleep less, perhaps. Although I'd like to sleep more, but I certainly treasure moments of above all, lucidity. I think that's the main thing. You may not always feel well, but I think that what you want is a kind of clarity of mind and a certain detachment of mind that enables you to see what's valuable or to separate what's valuable from less valuable. And to savor the moments that count, I think.
Now, this might seem like a vertiginous change of subject too, but you were very much identified for a while, not just with your book on Orientalism, but with other essays, with a new criticism that demanded that people pay attention to texts and also to their origins and their context and so forth. There were sometimes, as I think you still are, sometimes attacked for your promiscuity in this respect. And some of the deconstructionist types in the American Academy now are sort of blamed on you from time to time. But I noticed that when you were running the Modern Languages Association, when it was, I think, your year to be chair or president, excuse me, Mr. President.
My dear fellow.
Je m'excuse. That you actually, you seem to have become, or perhaps had always been somewhat impatient with some of this stuff.
Well, yes, I mean, perhaps this will bring us finally to Orwell, which you had promised to.
I'm saving that up.
Oh, I see.
You see my stealth tactic.
I do, yes.
The net was spread in the sight of the bird, but...
right, well, I'm not going to wiggle out.
On what many people have become impatient within the Academy, the feeling that no author is any good or any better than another, that it's just as good to study advertising as it is to study Milton. That kind of thing.
Yes. I have very little patience with that simply because I've always believed in the existence of an aesthetic realm in which obviously distinctions have to be made, and matters of taste count for me a great deal. I mean, obviously I find greater pleasure in reading Melville than I do in Danielle Steele.
How do you know that you don't like Danielle Steele?
I don't. Her name just came to mind.
I had a terrible feeling.
I've never read Danielle Steele, to tell you the honest truth. And I have no plans.
Robert Ludlum, the late Ludlum?
No, Ludlum is different. I mean, the relentless plotting of some of his novels carried me through a bit, but I gave him up. It's too much of an effort. Yeah. So there's that. Then there's the quality of a kind of. Yes, I'll have some of that. Thank you. Some of your fine ginger ale. Thank you. For the throat. My throat is on its way, on its last legs. But the other thing is that there has developed, not just in literary circles, in academic circles, but in the world of professionals, there has developed a kind of jargonistic language of expertise, which is designed to alienate and distance the lay person and to assert the authority of whoever the expert is. And the appalling jargon, which is ascribed to...
Say again, jargon.
Jargon,
yes.
And difficulty of concept, is supposed to signal the authority and profundity of the writer. And that strikes me as a total fraud. That some of my colleagues who go around speaking on, jaw-shattering prose and trying to articulate ideas that are so deep and obscure that they belong in Pope's Dunciad, are really debasing the humanities and the value of humanistic principles, which I think can be universalized, not just confined to the literary text, but also to political and indeed international behavior of a kind which is often goes uncriticized. Anyway, so it's that really that I've taken a very strong position against.
So then, to my long-harbored grudge...
He's been saving this up for
yes.
a long time. Yes.
Well, actually, some years now it's been. I was sad to see that you reprinted that piece in your new, very beautifully produced, I must say, and wonderfully organized collection. In reading your attack on George Orwell in there, you're feeling that there's something parochial about him, something... Well, actually, I should not...
Don't bring up parochial,
put any words in your mouth.
On that one.
Say there was because what I thought you said about him, I won't mince words, was so bad and was so ill-grounded that I thought it must proceed from a dislike that you hadn't quite expressed. There must be something behind it.
What in particular?
An animus. Well, I'm asking you. I ask the questions around here.
Well,
there was an animus that seemed to... There must be. I just presumed its existence. You don't like him, and you couldn't quite say why. And I want to know what
I think I could say why, and I shall proceed to do so.
By all means.
It seems to me that, first of all, what is most prized about Orwell today, and has historically been very much his hallmark, is his style. I mean, that there is an unadorned, plain way of speaking and writing, which many of us admire, me too. I mean, I admire it also. But what it seems to me he does in the process, I'm not now talking about so much the style, but the material around which his style turns, is there's a kind of self-mutilation that occurs which gives rise to the thought that the subjects he writes about are there for him to write about and then move away. In other words, what I was disturbed by, I mean, there's no return really, for example, to the Catalonia he writes about in Homage to Catalonia. There's nothing in his later writing that suggests no return.
Go back.
Yeah. What?
You mean he doesn't go back?
Well, I mean that the subject really turns into something quite sour. That is to say, the failed republicanism of the war of the Civil War in Spain. The Yorkshire miners that he writes about in The Road to Wigan-Pier are people that he visits but never really returns to. I call it tourism among the dogs, and there is a kind of censorious quality to him, which I find it repellent. You know, I don't admire it. As for his
is it a moral superiority, or do you suspect it of being an English superiority?
Well, I think
not that those two things can't be
Anglocentric. I think it's Anglocentric in a way. I think it's and a moral superiority.
That was my suspicion, was that you detected Anglocentrism.
I think so.
There will come a time when I'll be able to tell you how wrong you are, but the time it won't be now, because I now know I received the relevant instruction that we're out of time, and I hope you're sorry, ladies and gentlemen, about that. And I wish I had the power to extend the soiree, but we aren't empowered that way. I would simply say thank you again, very much indeed, for coming. Thank you, Edward, extraordinarily for your sumut. And that if you that's nice. Bravo. No, please. It's for you. Thank you very much.
Christopher is the best of interlocutors.